with Meg and then we'll open it to the floor.
Okay, well, David ended on a point echoing Helena, which was also a point that I very much agreed with. I know I'm on the panel as a defender of politics, which is a tricky thing.
Yes.
That the expenses crisis was a huge thing, but it was a symptom of a bigger problem. In a sense, I hope, it was the climax of something which has been quite nasty for quite a long time. And I would like to say a word about the expenses crisis, because although I would not for a minute defend all of the things that all of those people did, some bad stuff happened, I have no doubt. I think it got a bit hysterical. And it was indicative of just how negative we've become about our political class, how hysterical we felt able to get about it. Actually, as we know, a lot of the people who were exposed in that crisis, they were not actually breaking the rules. They were following a culture which was an endemic culture in the Commons, which was saying, these expenses are in lieu of salary, claim them. They were encouraged to claim them by officials and so on. One of the most interesting bits of coverage I heard during the crisis was when there was a psychologist on the Today programme who was asked, how typical are these people of the average person? Are they not extremely corrupt in comparison with the average person? And the response was no, actually. Looking at what they've done and knowing what we know about the average person would have taken much more out of the system than these people did. I am surprised by how little they took advantage of the system. And they were accused of flipping their homes, for example, to avoid capital gains tax. Personally, I have no problem in saying I found that morally repugnant. But what they were doing was taking the advice that any accountant would give any person who walked into their office. They were taking the advice that appears on the personal finance pages of the Daily Telegraph, which exposed them. So while we get morally outraged about them doing that, and I'm happy to go along with that outrage, why are we not morally outraged about, I'm a bit of an old lefty, I'm sorry, the other people who do that? Because I think that is equally unacceptable. So it does tell us something about how we like to be negative about our politicians. The bigger story, I think, is more worrying. The way that we have been perhaps disengaging over recent years and feel it's okay to be this negative. Although I do agree with David that the evidence shows that this negativity has been around for a long time. One of the slightly worrying things, and I should mention I do have a day job as well, which I'm a full-time academic at University College London, I'll just get that plug in. One of the problems, I think, is people have felt negative about politics and politicians for a long time. But we've learnt that they felt negative only as a result of research over time. And the more we know that they feel that way, the more journalists, other politicians, other commentators feel able to get nastier and nastier about what they say about politics and politicians, because they know that it fits the public mood. And actually, I think we've got a spiral of nastiness going on. What I said in my pamphlet was that I think politics is very vulnerable in a number of ways. I think politics increasingly exists as a little island of collective action in an increasingly hostile world. The world is hostile because we are an increasingly rich consumer culture where more and more things are traded for money, we're more legalistic, we're more demanding as individuals. And politics doesn't have that culture. Politics is about doing things together. It's about doing things voluntarily. It's not about trading, and it's not about individualism, and that makes politics vulnerable. It's also vulnerable because our media culture has become much more competitive. We all know the difficulties that newspapers have, how the media has exploded. It's much more competitive than it used to be. News has to be cheaper now. And nastiness sells newspapers, and it's also cheap to report. And we've also developed, I think, an increasingly negative pressure group culture, in part to feed a negative media. I'm not uncritical by any means of politicians. One of the things that I am most critical of politicians for is actually not communicating to us what politics is about. We're switched off from a political culture because we've all become consumers. And politicians don't explain to us how politics is different to consumerism. In some ways, they try and turn politics into another branch of consumerism. That cannot work. That is doomed to fail. Politics is about collective decisions, it's about negotiation, compromise, not everybody getting what they want all of the time.
But isn't it also about serving? I mean, isn't it also about service to others?
Absolutely.
Which is the opposite of individual. Sorry.
Politicians don't actually explain this to us very much. They don't say politics is all about negotiation and compromise and there are no right answers some of the time and it's difficult. They're not good at saying those things. If they said those things, I think that we would respect them and their profession a little more. In some ways, and this is a denigrating thing to say about politicians, I think actually a lot of them don't understand fundamentally what it is that they're doing. They don't understand what politics is for and how it's different to the rest of the world. They are ill-educated in it. Academics are not good at explaining what politics is and what it's for and how it's not consumerism. Academics hold some of the blame, I think. Academics actually like to see politicians as self-interested, greedy, people who will accrete power and money to themselves. No wonder we look at them like that, and maybe it becomes self-fulfilling in some ways. I'm also concerned, as I said, about the negative culture of pressure groups. I think we've seen a fragmentation of political debate into special interests, parties there to balance interests, represent and trade interests off against each other. Pressure groups are there for narrow interests, to fight for their interest above all else. And they will use a negative media culture in order to try and smear politicians, blame them for not delivering things. They don't have to worry about, if they get more money, who's going to get less money. These are the things that politicians have to worry about, although they don't tell us it very much. This is a slightly depressing thing to say and a slightly controversial thing to say with Helena on the panel, but working in the constitutional field, I actually think that the so-called democracy pressure groups are actually some of the worst offenders in this, and they are feeding on this negativity, including after the expenses crisis, increasingly hysterical descriptions we see of our political system, that it's rotten and corrupt, that we have broken democracy, we don't live in a real democracy, etc. And I'm afraid to say the campaign being run by Power 2010, which Helena is associated with the organisation, although she tells me she doesn't like the campaign and that the campaign itself is nothing to do with her, which is putting up posters in constituencies accusing MPs of crimes against democracy. Posters saying this MP is wanted for crimes against democracy. These are not crimes. What these MPs did was express different opinions to the people running this campaign. They were opposed to an elected House of Lords or proportional voting systems or whatever. These are not crimes, these are different opinions. And thought crimes, we know, are not things which people should be accused of in a democracy. They exist in a different kind of system, which we might call Orwellian in the negative sense. So, winding up, I think the political class is wounded. I'm very depressed about it, and I agree with Cristina, it has to be saved, because the only alternative to politics is non-politics. And what does that mean? It means unfettered markets, or anarchism, or totalitarianism. Politics is not perfect, we don't all get what we want out of it, but that is the nature of it. We need to somehow embrace that and learn to love it with all its imperfections.